So good afternoon, everyone. I am Nancy Sinkoff. I'm the academic director of the Alan and Joan Bildner Center for the Study of Jewish Life here at Rutgers, New Brunswick, and I am a professor of Jewish Studies and History. And I'm delighted to welcome you to this talkback on the Israeli TV series Autonomies, which is part of the 21st annual Rutgers Jewish Film Festival. I know many of you are loyal goers, but it's amazing to think that the film festival has been going on for 2 decades and is one of the most important public events of the Bildner Center and for Rutgers itself. These are the rules. You're all muted right now. I think you are used to these webinars, and if you have questions in the context of the conversation that I'm having with our guest, just put them into the chat. And about 25 minutes into this, I will open up those questions. I will pose them on your behalf. So please feel free to ask any questions. I want to thank, in particular, the staff of the Alan and Joan Bildner Center for the Study of Jewish Life. Karen Small, the managing director of the center, works tirelessly on everything we do, but particularly as the director of the film festival, she works even more tirelessly. Jenny Gurman, who's the tech person behind this call today, the senior department administrator and center administrator, also works tirelessly. Sarah Portilla, Hannah Feldman, Darcy Marr, we have an extraordinary staff who are all working overtime and in this digital pivot that we're all coping with. So I want to thank them and give them a big shout out right now. So finally, I'm going to meet our guest, who you see in the other box, and who, believe it or not, is all the way over the pond. He's joining us from Oxford. Professor Yaacov Yadgar is the Stanley Lewis Professor of Israel Studies at Oxford University. He's written extensively on matters of Jewish identity, nationalism, secularism, modernity, and tradition in Israel. He's the Stanley Lewis Professor of Israel Studies at Oxford. He's the author of many important publications, including Our Story, The National Narratives in the Israeli Press, which was published in Hebrew by Haifa University Press in 2004, Sovereign Jews, Israel, Zionism and Judaism in 2017, and very recently, the Jewish Identity Crisis, State and Politics in the Middle East, 2020. Yaacov Yadgar also served as the Schusterman Visiting Scholar in Israel Studies at the Bildner Center in 2007-2008. And in that year, he developed the free online course that you can take called The Israeli Political System. I imagine that it probably needs a little bit of updating just because 12 years down the pike, as always in the modern state of Israel, politics are ever changing and ever evolving. Yaacov was the perfect person, to my mind, to engage in a conversation about this television series, which has captured the imagination of many people for good and for bad, and raises all kinds of issues about contemporary Israeli society. So the way it's going to work today is that Yaacov and I are going to be in conversation about this series, about a whole host of issues, of course, emphasizing the political cultural factions in Israel. And we welcome your questions and comments regarding the series. I do realize that some of you may not have seen all 4 episodes yet. So if you ask a question that refers to the latter part of the series, you might want to say spoiler alert, but whatever, that's what you get with television these days. You can't keep track. So welcome, Yaacov. I'm so happy to see you, even if it's far away.
Thank you for the wonderful invitation to be with you. It's also my second time now with the Rutgers Film Festival.
That's right.
I do remember that last time I was there, everybody were talking about the Borat film that just came out, and it's now the time for the subsequent film. So I guess
people were talking about Borat. Oh my God.
Yes. So
yes, and now we have subsequent
movie film. Yes.
Yeah. A movie film.
It's a delight to be with you. Thank you.
We could talk about Borat later. Anyway, great. So, so obviously political and cultural polarization, which is in some ways the word of the hour, not only in Israel, but the word of the hour in 2020, polarization, is a leitmotif of this series. And certainly it touches on, even though it's a melodramatic television series, on the gap real and imagined between secular and religious Jewish Israelis, right? That's the portrait in this film. So from your perspective as a scholar of contemporary Israel, what's accurate, or what's at least something we can hold on to that's real about this gap? What's not real, and what's missing in this, fictional depiction of contemporary Israel from your perspective?
Yeah, I think the one major element that is authentic about this depiction is the perception of a binary that allegedly shapes and defines Israeli society. Practically every discussion on Israeli Jewish identity, almost every book you would open about Israeli Jewish identity will tell you that this cleavage, the secular religious cleavage, which is oscillating between two, how would I call them, gravitational poles of the ultra-Orthodoxy on one side and the secularism, the vehement kind of secularism that at one point in the series, the head of state of the newly released secular state is pronouncing, this vehement anti-religiosity in a sense, is that what defines Israeli society. But I think what's missing is reality, because between perception and reality, there's much more. If we want to think of this through this notion of identities, Jewish identities in Israel, then really what's missing are the vast majority of Israeli Jews who are neither nor. So they're neither Haredi, ultra-Orthodox, Yiddish-speaking, Hasidic, Rebbe following religious Jews, nor, I don't know exactly what are the, characteristics of the Tel Aviv part of the movie, but, the ones who are, in a sense, indifferent to tradition. The vast majorities of Israelis are somewhere between these two poles, if you want to continue, holding on to this cleavage discourse. Importantly, they are also mostly non-Ashkenazim, so we're missing here something that is not only about religious identity, but also about ethnicity and class. But all of this is within the Jewish Israeli community, as you rightly noted. I think the major element missing from this picture are the Palestinians. One obvious question to ask from the beginning, well, it kind of makes sense for the two groups to separate, right? So why is it that reality holds them together? Why do they not just, give each other their get and divorce each other in whatever configuration? And the hint to this answer is actually in the setting of the film. If you noticed, that's not a spoiler, already at the beginning, you see the Jerusalem enclave of the ultra-Orthodox depicted through the wall that is really built right now in Israel to separate the Palestinians from the Israelis. And this is in a certain, from a certain point of view, this is what really holds them together, the sense of a shared conflict, or a shared side in the conflict.
Well, it's interesting that that's your take on this. There is a moment in the film where, again, it's not really spoiler, if it is spoiler, there's nothing really I can do about it. There is more than there is at one point where you see a checkpoint, a bona fide checkpoint, going into what is either the contemporary Palestinian area or crossing a border. I'm trying to be careful for those people who haven't seen it. So you actually see a so-called checkpoint, a real checkpoint with real Palestinians online. And it's the only time in the film that you see that. Yeah. Obviously, or not so obviously, the writers of the films, of the series, wanted to focus on the perception of this great divide in their minds of Israeli Jewish society. So this is very much being pitched to those questions. And to push you a little bit, I don't think those questions are not real, right? So the two main issues that come up regarding whether or not the Haredi or the autonomous region of ultra-Orthodox, again, the word Haredi is one of these complicated words. Are they Hasidic or just ultra-Orthodox? I mean, we know that there's a variety in the spectrum there, but the two big issues that they don't want to concede, and hence they've separated after this crisis of 67, you know, there's this evocation of a civil war that has occurred earlier, right? There's something has happened earlier that has made them separate, right? And they don't want to join the Zionist enterprise. And those two issues are induction into the army and the introduction of secular education into the school system. Yeah. And from my perspective, and again, I'm happy to tangle with you, I think those are real issues.
Yeah.
They're not made up issues. And they're issues that go back, you know me as an historian of the Jews of Europe, this goes back to the 18th century. How will modern Jewish educational systems balance the traditions of Torah, the Masoret, languages, and the needs and demands of integration into civil society that requires vernacularization and secularization? So, I mean, I'd like to hear what you think. I don't think that's fiction. I think that's real. So what do you think?
There's no doubt about it. I mean, the tension, the modern tension, the contemporary tension within Israeli society surrounding these issues is exactly about these two elements, the imminent draft of, or the continuously imminent draft of ultra-Orthodox yeshiva students to the Israeli military, and the degree to which the government or the state can intervene in Haredi education. The Israeli term is the core studies, which for generations now, I guess, have been promoted, at least by the non-Haredi side, as a necessary element of incorporating Haredi society within the Israelis. But the reality is obviously much more complicated than that. There are, again, plenty of books and plenty of articles on the Israelization of Haredim, their integration within Israeli society to a degree to which no such binary perception could account for. But I mean, there's no doubt about this, that the question of the relationship between ultra-Orthodoxy and modern Jewish nationalism hang around such issues, I think, more important than the draft, because the draft or the conscription to the army, to a large degree, becomes, the more we progress with time, it becomes less important, because the army doesn't need all of those soldiers. It's a national question, right? It has to do with sociopolitics. So it has to do with the question of the level of integration between the two groups, if you like. And as you say, there's a history to this. And the history, I think, is primarily the question of what does it mean for one to be Jewish? Or what does it mean for a society to be Jewish? And here the contest is between two mutually opposing answers.
Well, I agree. That's why I love the title of your newest book, Jewish Identity Crisis, State and Politics. What?
Yes. Israel's Jewish identity. We all have a Jewish identity crisis, but
you know what? No. Sorry about that. You know what? That's what happens when you read. And yes, Israel's. let's re-emphasize that, Israel's Jewish identity. But no, I love the title because I think it's absolutely accurate, and you write on Israel. But I would extend it, I think, as you know, that it's a modern Jewish identity crisis. I always argue myself that the same questions get posed for contemporary Jews in the diaspora. It's just the state and politics are different. But I mean, certainly, and you probably know this, that there are lawsuits today in the state of New York being waged against certain Haredi communities for not fulfilling the educational mandates of New York State. So they're being licensed by New York State, but the children, particularly boys, it's quite gendered actually, the boys are not being educated, and the girls often get a more expansive secular education and an English language. We'll talk about language in a second, an English language education, because they will be integrated in the workforce. Again, these are generalizations, but much more than the boys. So these are suits that are being waged now, often instigated by individuals who've left those communities, right? In English, it's OTD, off the derech, which is a, off the path, or in Hebrew, datim shel dat lashim, right? People who were formerly religious and left.
Yeah.
So it's a modern Jewish identity crisis, but it plays out very differently in the modern state of Israel because it's quote unquote a Jewish society,
Yes.
and the state is Jewish.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. So I think this is actually, I can, if I can share this with you, when I first heard about the series, and I was invited actually to comment on it in this different universe where people met each other, and I went to London on the tube, and we sat together in one hall. The thing that really motivated me was the potential promise of exactly dealing with Israel's Jewish identity question. In other words, if you now depict this binary where Haredim live a Bnei Brak kind of lifestyle, or to the Brooklyn kind of lifestyle that one could somehow imagine or depict, the interesting question is, so how would this newly released from the Haredi hold or from the ultra-Orthodox hold secular community understand its Jewishness? And this was really my biggest, if you ask me what's my biggest critique and my biggest disappointment from the show, it's that it really is, as far as I've seen it, I haven't seen the whole series, maybe, and it's, who knows, a series, a second season or a third season can develop this. But as far as I've seen, at least as a setting of the relationships within it, there's not much by way of dealing with this question. It's just understood to be, Tel Aviv minus Haredim right now. But even in Tel Aviv today, even in any, in Israeli society generally, the question is heard. The question demands answers. And it demands answers primarily because of the other thing that I mentioned earlier, that there's a conflict that is justified by Israel's Jewish identity claims. And this is maybe, again, to agree with you and to just, argue a little bit. It is really the same in this regard with diaspora Jewry or non-Israeli Jewry, but there's this difference in diaspora. There isn't necessarily a government working in the name of your Jewishness to which you have to account for.
100%. I agree with you 100%. When in the series, when they're the flashbacks to the Civil War, they show members of the Israeli police. So this is a Jewish police on horses, the cavalry. And I have to tell you, this is an amazing image. You may remember, or you may not, and I'm going to date it incorrectly. Maybe 10 years ago, 12 years ago, there was the effort to, to take down, disassemble a settlement, a religious settlement. And schoolgirls resisted the Israeli cavalry. And there was a photograph in the New York Times. I'll never forget it because I used it for teaching, showing policemen on horses and little girls behind like shields. And I would show it to my students and I would sort of ask them to think about history. I said, is this the Roman army? Whose army is this? Yeah. And I think that's what makes the Israeli Jewish identity crisis different, is that the state acts in the name of Jewishness for Jews. Yeah. Yeah. The state acts, and it has broader implications. The issues in the diaspora are they're real. But the state does not act, the state in the North American diaspora, let me say, acts in the name of some kind of civil, universalist, enlightened toleration. Those values, they're not Jewish, quote unquote, Jewish values, but but the challenge is that the goal is integration. Yeah. And if you live in what Adam Furtziger, colleague of ours, has called enclavist societies, modern enclavism. These are enclaves that have deliberately separated themselves in many ways. Even if there is some integration economically, they do not accept the value of integration. It's an anti-modern modernism. And, all of the Haredim in this film, they're up to date with cell phones and all that tech.
Yeah.
But that's modernity as a tool. That's not modernity as an ideology.
Yeah. And it's not statism as an ideology. As far as I understand, the setting of the film, they're not a state, they're an autonomy.
They've seceded and they're an autonomy, right?
Yeah, so they don't claim sovereignty, which makes sense, theologically.
Right. Wait, so can you just say what you mean by that? I know what you mean, but what do you mean?
Part of the difficulty of the non-Zionist or the a-Zionist, if you want, not necessarily anti-Zionist, ultra or orthodoxy generally regarding Zionism, is that traditionally exile, as in the sense of lacking sovereignty, is understood to be a punishment from God, God's willing. And traditionally, the understanding has been that the correction of this punishment, i.e., the recreation of the Jewish kingdom, if you like, would only be a divine action or divine act. So the nationalist movement's assertion of self-sovereignty, the idea of this worldly sovereignty run by people in the name of maybe a historical right, has been the most contested in this regard, because it is seen also as a theological transgression. And the enclave mentality plays an interesting role in this, specifically in Israel, because enclave mentality or enclave societies exist also outside of Israel, also outside of Judaism. I mean, you're not so far from Pennsylvania, right? I mean, there's another group there that kind of is an enclave, but
no, there are enclaves all over the United States. Our society really lets it happen. Yeah,
exactly. And this is, I think, so again, this is why for me, thinking about those enclaves is a little bit less exciting than thinking about the vast majority who sees itself, or the people who see themselves as the quintessential, unidentified, unhyphenated Israeli, and then to ask them the question of their Jewishness.
Right. Well, I understand why. I mean, I know that, that's very much a research, and as you noted, this is really an Ashkenazic series. So I want to, and it's funny for me to talk to you about this, because I'm a scholar of the Jews of Eastern Europe. This particular identity, this particular inflection of identity problems, or this, let me say that better, the inflection of identity, the crisis of identity in this series is very much Ashkenazic. Yeah. And it harkens back to older debates in the Enlightenment and throughout the 19th century about the relationship of Ashkenazic Jews to modern society, both diasporic and to Zionism. And you see that in who we're talking about. The figure, the Haredim speak Yiddish, although it's interesting, they also speak Hebrew. And one could say, well, here we have integration, right? Because they're speaking the modern state language, right? Not all, so that is integration, actually. Many years ago, I heard a great talk that among ultra-Orthodox, this is already probably 20 years ago, that Lashon Kodesh, right? The holy language is Yiddish. Why? Because it protects Haredim and ultra-Orthodoxy from being integrated linguistically into modern Hebrew. Yeah. Because once you start speaking, knowing modern Hebrew, a whole host of worlds open up.
But they do speak Hebrew. I mean, that's the thing. They're multilingual in this regard.
Yeah. There's a new diglosia, what we call diglosia, right? The relationship between Yiddish and not biblical Hebrew, but Yiddish, Aramaic, citations from traditional literature, and actually modern Hebrew. And you heard English in it too. And I think that's we need Professor Ayala Fader to unpack that for us, because the language integration is very interesting. But you did hear Yiddish throughout the series, and you probably know this, and many other people, that there's Eli Rosen. I don't know if he was the person for this, but Eli Rosen is a former Chassid who is the consultant on all of these series now, on Unorthodox, on Shtisel, making sure that the Yiddish is right, because they're different dialects of Yiddish.
Yeah.
So it underscores the fact that this is an Ashkenazic problem, right? There are no,
Yes.
although, so now I'll throw out the challenge. The secular couple are Moroccan.
Yeah.
And they speak French.
Yes. Yes. And so there's, like any Israeli cultural production, you must ask the question, and usually you don't like the answers regarding presentation of the non-Ashkenazim. Let's call it this way. It's interesting. I mean, yeah, one has to judge for oneself regarding how Mizrahi masculinity, for example, is depicted, how, what kind of depth you have to the different characters and so forth, and the agency they have. But it is, so again, for me to step in your field for a second, it's clear that the historical roots of the problem are Eastern European roots, and that Israel is now a setting for the playing out of this history. So the whole, the whole narrative of secularization, of the Enlightenment and Haskalah, and the invention of Jewish Orthodoxy as a counter-reaction to this, which all now become identity founding realities in any people live their lives according to this. This is not just stories we tell our students as history, and it's sad to see, in a sense, the discourse and the serious as the autonomies as just an example of it, perpetuating this narrow lens view of Israeli society. Because if you ask me what the solution is right next to them. The solution is probably the Moroccan family. And I don't know how much they depict. Again, there's a series, you can develop it whatever you want, but I can pretty much assume that the Moroccan family first has an unmediated experience of, a synagogue life. So they're not the Tel Aviv indifference to the Haredi world. They could even make an assertive claim to what Jewishness is really about. They probably have relatives who do go to the autonomy because they feel more comfortable with the ultra-Orthodox. They probably have a couple of cousins who speak Yiddish now because they went to Haredi yeshivot. But this is it. The history of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa and Muslim countries has been different. There is no rupture that we have to overcome. And in a sense, if Israeli Judaism or Israeli Jewishness was more attentive and more willing to assign value to this, traditionism, as I call it, this masortiyut, not as in the Masorti movement, but exactly in this ability to be dynamically negotiating and loyal to tradition, then the breaking up of this of Jewish world into competing denomination would be overcome.
Well, I have so much to say about this because it really gets to the heart of my work, as you said. And this isn't about me and you, really. It's about the series.
Yeah.
But it raises this idea of a rupture and between church and state. And the thing is, Jewish civilization, just like Islam, cannot be easily made into a binary, right? Yeah. And what the Sephardic or the Mizrahi or the Yemeni or the non-Ashkenazic populations of Israel, what they perform and what they live is a non-binary identity. Yeah. The big question, and we can't really answer it, is whether or not that can truly be modernized in the West, because Israel still functions sort of with Western categories. But I'm not sure we can really answer that in today's talk. And I want to get back to a little bit more to the film if we can, and then we'll raise some questions. And you may not really want to address this exactly, but there has been critique of this whole genre of OTD, or off the derech. Yeah. This film isn't exactly that, but it is a kind of secular gaze onto the Haredi world. And do you, have you seen Shtisel or Unorthodox, or do you have how would you characterize that, this sort of
Well,
secular
I'm
gaze?
happy to be critical, actually.
Yeah, go for it.
I feel uncomfortable with the voyeurism that is entailed in this. And I can tell you this. So as I mentioned
You're not
earlier,
alone, but go for it.
yeah, so I mentioned earlier, I actually commented on the series also here in the London Jewish Film Festival a, a year ago, almost less than a year, but almost a year ago. And the reactions from the audience were kind of surprising. One member of the audience stood up and said it's the first time she came to the film festival. She was really looking forward to it. She drove far away, and she cannot understand why they show anti-Semitic propaganda as part of the Jewish Film Festival. And what she was referring to was this sense of the depiction of the Haredi duplicity, oh, they like shinken and they like porn, and I'm not spoiling anything, right? It's the very beginning of and yes, and tourism. And then another reaction was from someone who said that she's an Israeli and she's lived in the UK for 50 years, still counting herself an Israeli, and everything they say in the movie about Haredim is true. in a sense, justifying the. But having said that, listen, in art generally, I think in film and TV more than maybe other forms of art, the particularistic is the way to say something universal. And the appeal of such shows, why do people watch Shtisel? Not because they think it's necessarily a documentary about how the Haredi community lives, because it does something human. And I didn't watch The Sopranos when it was on TV because I thought, oh, all Italian Americans like that, right? But there was something in the depiction of a very particular point of view of life that, if made right, can tell us something about ourselves, even if we're completely removed from that. And in this, well, again, the audience has to decide whether they connect or not.
I will say, having seen the series and reviewed it several times in prep, what was interesting about this particular series was the degree, are the characters sympathetic? Are the characters unsympathetic? I would say, actually, that the women in the film, in the series, almost to a woman, are very sympathetic characters. They're not duplicitous, generally speaking. They emphasize the humanistic issues. I mean, obviously, again, this is not a spoiler because it's very early in the series. This is sort of a Solomonic, leitmotif about a child and who gets to raise a particular child, and the apocryphal stories that Solomon knew who the real mother was when she said, don't cut the child in half, right? So who the real parent is who won't harm the child. So the women actually have a great, I think, more sympathy than the male characters. And that itself is very interesting because the depiction often of the ultra-Orthodox or Haredi world is that the women are just passive vessels for male sexuality, male kedusha, and women are relegated to the home and to childbearing of large families, et cetera, and so forth. And it's often very negative. And the idea is that the patriarchy is alive and well. And it was quite interesting, I thought, no matter what you think about the series, that the women had voices, real voices, and were quite sympathetic, from Yona Bride, his wife Blumi, to Elka, the daughter of the Grand Rebbe, to the Moroccan woman, the seamstress. She, had a strong voice. So I thought that was actually an interesting choice. They might not have done that, and they decided to. Trying to think if there's anything else generally we should speak about, or we should open it up to our, I think we've touched on quite a few things. So I'm gonna open it up to our chat, and then if there's something that you or I feel like would be added to it. So let me see, I welcome our audience's participation, and let me see what we have here. So one viewer said that from his perspective, the core of the series is about economic dependence of the Haredi world on the state and the secular society. To what degree can you speak to that, Yaacov, on the economic issues about either the perception of Haredi Judaism or not. You know, what role is economics played here?
It is, first of all, the economic data, the hard data is pretty clear. The two most deprived communities in Israel are the Palestinians and the Haredim. So the two poorest towns in Israel are a Haredi and a Palestinian town within Israel. And it's almost a given to anyone who studies Israeli ultra-Orthodox or Orthodox community, the Haredi community, to understand that there has developed there a lifestyle in which economic hardship is almost built into it. And the reasons for this are largely political. And the most interesting thing is to compare these communities to the Brooklyn communities, if you like. The relationship with the state is such that allows this, how would I call it, low intensity poverty to continue. So very roughly, to describe the situation, ever since the establishment of the State of Israel, there has been an agreement between the Zionist leadership and the Haredi leadership that yeshiva students, so men who study in yeshiva, will be exempt from servicing in the army. What people don't usually remind is that these people are also not allowed to go to work. Supposedly, if you want the luxury of study, you can't do, in a sense, to maintain the authenticity of this claim. And this creates a situation where people remain in yeshivot even if they are not necessarily interested in studying, or they may be not capable of being Elohim in studying the Torah, science of studying the Torah, and they consist of, their main source of income, were it not for the women who go out and work and provide for the family, are meager stipends from the state. Now, they are meager individually. Collectively, they are a big amount of money that is always contested. It is always part of the debate on the Israeli parliament or Israeli Knesset regarding the state's budget. But it is a situation where the mutual agreement between the two sides actually designates Haredim into life in poverty. And it is the service in the army that kind of hovers over everything to maintain this situation. Because were it not for the service in the army, you can imagine that many Haredi male would just go out and work. If they have the proper education to do so and the proper background to develop this, that's another question.
Well, but that's where, again, I can speak more to the U.S. case. The education is real. The education is real. I mean, again, whenever I have read, and we had Shulam Dean come to the Bildner Center and speak, he wrote a really moving memoir called Those Who Leave Do Not Return. I hope I'm getting the title right. But he talked about what it was like to even learn English and what it was like to learn the most basic computer literacy. And if you don't have that and you're 18 years old or 19 years old and you already have a family to support, it really is challenging. So I think the educational piece and the economic mobility are directly related. In Israeli society, what used to be, as you said, the sort of normative induction into the army, that was also a mobility, right? That gave you mobility and integration into the society. What Israel's facing today, you noted, doesn't, quote, need as many soldiers, but that itself could be problematic for civil, if you will, the creation of a civil fabric. I mean, in the United States, we don't have induction. We have a professional army, and the result is a great divide between the majority of Americans who serve and protect this country and those who do not. I mean, these are really very big issues about how to create a modern society with civic norms that people feel attached to without being nationalistic lunatics, right? I mean, these are really, I think at its best, the series asks some of those questions. Let me see, someone wanted some evidence from you. What do you think are the markers of the extent of ultra-Orthodox or Haredi integration into Israeli society. What would be, your data points there?
Yeah. So first of all, I have to say, this is not my data point. I study Israeli identity more generally, not specifically the Haredi community. I read the literature, and I actually found it very interesting when I, encounter this literature, specifically anthropological and sociological literature, to see exactly how those authors identify these markers of Israeli nation or the Israeli integration of the Haredim. It's basically about seeing the Haredim where the observers don't expect to see them. So I remember having this conversation once with someone who did an anthropological study of Haredim in Jerusalem, Yerushalayim, and she noted that with the opening of a new mall close to where Haredim live, you can see now Haredim sitting and having coffee in a cafe. And this was something to note. And my question is, why is this something to note? Why is this not something normal that people would do? Again, I can imagine people outside of Israel. Highland Park has several kosher restaurants, and you can see people of all different denominations sitting in a restaurant to have a meal. What's the big deal here? But more than that, I think is more politically looking at the question, we see more and more assertiveness on the side of Haredi communities in pronouncing political stances that negotiate with the state, positively so. The fact that some of the fastest growing settlements in the West Banks are Haredi cities, so cities that the state designate largely for Haredi communities, to which people move mostly because of economic considerations, not because of identification with the settlement project, but the ending up as part of this. And there you can see a very interesting correspondence, I would say, between state politics and the lived experiences of Haredi communities. It doesn't stretch to education, it doesn't stretch to service in the army, but it stretches to most all other aspects of communal life, from using media to the language. This is the thing, for me to go to Bnei Brak is always fascinating to hear them speak this Israeli Hebrew, not the Yiddish. The Yiddish, you would expect in some places, but the fact that it's such an Israeli Hebrew, such a Zionist language.
So I guess I would push you or push those scholars a little bit about, is that exactly integration? I mean, when I look, again, turning back to my part of the world, and our colleague Gershon Bacon, whom I'm sure you know at Bar Ilan, a historian, wrote a really fine book many years ago on the politics of the Aguda Yisrael in interwar Poland. And I'm not trying to just go down a rabbit hole for my sake. But what was so fascinating is he looked at a modern political party, a Haredi modern political party, Aguda Yisrael, and he looked at the ways they understood, the leadership understood exactly how to function like a modern political party. So they knew the tools of statecraft, media, dissemination, the whole 9 yards.
Yeah.
But so they were integrated pragmatically, if you will, or they were integrated, I'm not even sure what the word, instrumentally, but ideologically they were not integrated. Yeah. So I think that to me, that's one of the elephant in the room. The Haredi or ultra-Orthodox communities in Borough Park, Lakewood, and Kiryas Yoel may speak English. They may use technology. Some of their men may run, great technological shops on the west side of Manhattan, but it's an instrumental integration. It's not an ideological integration. Yeah. And the ideology still matters, or doesn't it?
Yeah. So this is exactly, so first of all, let us agree that when it comes to the vast majority of the Jewish people, except for the enclave communities, integration has been the mode of living for most. And then the question would be, as a non-Haredi, as someone who is very, systematic critique of the choices of these enclave communities, I would ask, why is integration such an important feature for the non-Haredim? Why are they a thorn in the eye of those communities to which they don't integrate? If it's about disobedience, if it's about abuse of human and civil rights, if it's about nefarious behavior, then by all means, I mean, this lack of integration should be dealt with. But if it's only the choice of relatively small communities, or at least a minority, sizable but still a minority, to insist on a different lifestyle where they, when they develop their own communal values, as communitarians would tell you, it's their right. Again, we have this very delicate question of the individual's rights, right? And how we can, for example, when gender is obviously a big issue here. But assuming there's a level of, communal right per se that is also independent of the individuals, there's a very good case to argue that integration is not something that can be enforced or even actively pursued.
I don't disagree with the analysis. I think that this gets back to, again, the title of your book and the title of my book, so to speak, which is The Dilemmas of Being a Modern Jew, right? What are the values of modern Jewish life? Are they integrationist or not? And putting the two up there, integration and enclave, who has the right to dictate what? And as you said, you have the question of individuals and gender. These things complicate.
And I think if I can just make a comment, because I'm sorry,
Sure.
we're not really taking the questions here, but
well, some of the questions are so specific to the show that's a little bit hard because you didn't write the show, I didn't write the show, so that's a little bit why I haven't jumped on those questions. But go ahead.
The point I want to raise is about what we're not talking about when we're talking about Israeli politics and Israel's Jewish identity crisis, and and diaspora's Jewish crisis. Which is the how would I call it, the ethical horizon of this whole discussion. Supposedly there is no ethical consideration, and when you read the tradition, not the one tradition, but when you negotiate with this kind of text, and when you read considerations of this tradition, such as Leon Roth, if I can mention, someone who I think doesn't receive the attention he should have received. That highlighted that the meaning of Jewish polity, in the sense of being a collective together in the world, is about the conduct of an ethical covenant. And to see that this is completely absent from discussions, neither in the Haredi enclave nor in the Tel Aviv supposedly hedonistic, jazz-loving, European enclave in the Middle East, and in academic discussions of them, I think there's something that's missing. And again, it's hard, it's difficult. There's no one ethics. It's not objectively something that we can talk about. It's a subjective definition. We would necessarily, as Judaism demands, fall into an argument about what it means and how how to implement, if you even want to do this. But I would still mention this, that there's room for this.
I think huge. I could commend to you a book called Esau and Jacob, published by my colleague Malachi Cohen, about trying to make European history Jewish and trying to think about if European Jewish history was written through the questions of Judaism. Anyway, just throw it out to the audience. Malachi Cohen, Esau and Jacob. It's a very thick book, so be careful what you ask for. So let me see if there are any questions. For example, someone said they're disturbed about the ending of the series, and I don't really know how to address that here, because I think there's some people maybe haven't seen the end, and the other is, I'm not sure what of the ending is disturbing. There were so many different pieces of it. So I ask that individual, if you want to pose the question to me at my email at Rutgers, I will forward it to Professor Yadgar, and maybe he'll be able to address it later. But I don't think we can do that now, and I don't want you to think that I'm ignoring you. Someone else said, isn't it true that there are non-Jewish Israelis who also don't serve in the army? So what about their integration? How does that affect their integration into the
Israeli
society as
Jews
a
who
whole?
don't serve in the army.
Huh?
Israeli Jews who don't serve in the army?
No, Israeli Palestinians
Oh yeah.
and there are other communities in the modern state who are not
Yeah.
inducted.
Yeah.
And how is that a litmus test to integration
Yeah.
becoming part of Israeli society? Can you speak to that?
So this is I think one of the most important issues, one of the most important keys to understanding Israeli society is to understand the relationship between military and society. And because of that, this is a highly charged, but also very wide question to answer. And I'll just give, in a sense, just a few highlights of, my thinking about it. First of all, the story of the army being the great integrationist body of Israeli society is largely a myth. It has been obviously a major player in the shaping of Israeli identity, surely a major shaper of Israeli identity, but it also perpetuates class differences, ethnic differences, and so much more, and gender differences, and so much more. Secondly, it's also a myth that everybody serves in the army, or at least all the Jews serve in the army. I know too many good friends of mine, for example, who's, just didn't feel like serving in the army. And since their parents had enough money, they could get the way out of it. Also, it's much better to serve at some part of the army than others in terms of life chances and everything else. Having said all of that, the army does draw some very important lines of belonging and lack of belonging within Israeli society, and this is an important point. All citizens are universally required to serve, except for those that the state doesn't actually make serve. And the one community that doesn't serve, that is not invited in a sense to serve, are the Palestinian citizens of Israel, or the Arab Israelis. Now, both sides, in a sense, agree to this arrangement, but think about the message that is immediately sent by this practice, that Palestinians cannot really be part of that which is the great unifier of Israeli society, that Palestinians cannot be part of the great national service that is the Israeli military. So it necessarily leaves them in a precarious situation regarding their citizenship and belonging to the nation state, or if you like, Nancy, integration. Interestingly, also, Israel plays a heavy hand in identifying different segments of Palestinian society, which it does recruit to the army and does allow a passage into a higher level of integration within the society, in a sense creating further, lack of integration within Palestinian community.
So I think what I would just close with saying, there's no doubt that the Army's myth as a vehicle of integration needs to be deflated. But again, it's not, like with anything, it's not totally true, right? That, there are ways, there are institutions that create this, again, civic fabric. And the question is, how strong are they? Look, I mean, this whole issue of the American Army being an integrationist vehicle, it was, and it wasn't, right? Because it also perpetuated racism, right? We know this. We know that African-American soldiers who fought came back to the Jim Crow South, So, but still serving in the army created identities for those African-Americans, right? I'll give you another example. In the 1930s, after the Great Depression in Hawaii, there were great plantations that employed indigenous labor, and they collapsed. And the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, was created, and it inducted many of those indigenous peoples in Hawaii to serve in the CCC. And it perpetuated an integrationist ethos. It made them into American men. It downplayed their indigeneity, but it also gave them jobs, allowed them to feed their families, created a kind of patriotism to American society. So like everything, there's a nuance to the way these institutions function.
Yeah, I can't remember
And
the name now. I'm sorry. This is not right to do this way, but I was listening to, the radio here, and they were interviewed an American scholar who just wrote a book about empire. And I mean, this is England, and she writes about empire. And the radio host asks her, "So, isn't there anything good about?" And she says, "No one asked, was there anything good about Nazism?" Nazism bought the Autobahn, right? People who ever been to Germany loves the Autobahn. Germans love the, but you don't say, well, there was something still good about Nazism, right? So not God forbid, I'm not mentioning that what we spoke about earlier, I'm not going to mention it in the same sentence. It's the same as Nazis. But I think there's a very complicated discussion to have about, well, it still has a positive element to it. I don't think this is really the topic of discussion today, army and society in Israel, but I would encourage our audience to think about it. What does it do to Israelis, non-Jews who do serve in the army?
So I'm looking at our time, and I think that the series, to its credit, despite many of the critiques that many people have, and our chat shows that they didn't like the characters, and I have you yourself had your critiques of it, but I think it does, like even with stereotypes or melodramas, it gets at some interesting questions, and it's certainly been a pleasure for me to engage in them with you. And I welcome everyone to look at Professor Yadgar's work. Again, his newest book, just to get it right this time, is Israel's Jewish Identity Crisis, State and Politics in the Middle East, out in 2020 and in English, yeah?
Yes.
Yeah, in English, so accessible to all.
Yes.
And you should hold it up. And just to tell our viewers, we have, again, another talk back tonight, The Rabbi Goes West, about Chabad Rabbi Goes to Montana. And tomorrow night, just to in the category of the diversity of Israel's society, I'll be doing a talk back with Beth Elise Hawk and the chef Einat Admoni on a film documentary about a food festival between Israeli Jewish and Israeli Palestinian chefs in Haifa. And I hope you'll join us for that. So thank you very much. Thank you, Yaacov. Pleasure to see you.
Thank you, Nancy. Thank you for the audience.
And thank you, our audience. See you soon.